The Sopranos is possibly the most important TV show ever made. Without The Sopranos, we wouldn't have shows like Breaking Bad, Game of Thrones, or Mad Men, to name a few. No doubt, there were great TV shows before The Sopranos, but there was never really anything that came off as a realistic deep dive into its subject matter and characters. Even great shows like The Waltons and Columbo felt like they were theatrical. They felt like they were productions that were being acted out for a live crowd. I've seen a lot of TV shows in my life, but in my opinion, The Sopranos is the first one to come off as 100% realistic and authentic. Now, credit where credit is due, because shows like Twin Peaks, The X-Files, and Oz did allow for a natural progression to take place. It wasn't as if we were watching Starsky and Hutch on day 1 and The Sopranos on day 2. There was a very natural artistic and tonal evolution within filmmaking throughout the years that made way for a show like The Sopranos to exist. The Sopranos was on the air the same time as a show like Friends. The Sopranos is very much presented as realistic, and Friends is very much presented as theatrical. There's a very distinct difference between the two, and that's not a bad thing either. Certain tones work for certain shows, and not every show has to be a massive deep dive. And that's not to say that The Sopranos is actually realistic to real life either.
If a mob boss was ever visiting a psychiatrist, he'd be in the trunk of his car by the end of the week, along with a psychiatrist. That would never happen. There's no way in the world, if a mob boss hit anybody, that guy would come back at him. No way. If he did, you don't ever raise your hand to a made guy.
The Sopranos isn't actually realistic, it's the execution that makes you believe that it is realistic. Take a video game story like The Last of Us, for example. The Last of Us takes place in a post-apocalyptic world where zombies have overrun the world and society has collapsed. Ellie is then revealed to be immune from the zombie virus and is the potential cure to save humanity. Now, on paper, The Last of Us is totally unrealistic, but it is the execution and the characters that make it work and make it believable. The Last of Us is essentially executed so well that it allows you to suspend your disbelief. If that same logic is taken and applied to The Sopranos, then it works. A mob show about a mob boss who goes to therapy sounds terrible in concept, but it is the execution that fundamentally makes it work. By the year 2013, the post-apocalyptic genre was overdone and tired. The Last of Us could have very easily failed had it not been executed in such a unique way when you compare it to the rest of the genre at the time. The post-apocalyptic setting serves as a backdrop and exists to serve the characters. We get invested in characters like Sam and Henry and their friendship with Joel and Ellie as they travel through the zombie-ridden United States. But whoops, Sam got bitten whilst escaping some zombies. Sam then turns into a zombie and quite literally mindlessly attacks Ellie. Henry then has no other choice but to kill his own brother, and then Henry can't take the emotional distress, so then he immediately kills himself right in front of Joel and Ellie. The developer Naughty Dog was able to take a very tired premise and make it fresh and unique. They were able to use the premise to its advantage and allowed it to serve the characters. The very same thing could be said about The Sopranos. By the year 1999, there had been decades upon decades of oversaturation of the mob genre, and by 1999 it was a very tired genre. However, with The Sopranos, the mob setting also serves as a backdrop for forefront character-driven stories. The mob backdrop exists to serve the characters and character development rather than the show actually being about the mob. The Sopranos is actually about how Tony Soprano balances his home life with his work life, and it is intentionally mundane despite his job being that of a mob boss. Whereas a movie like Analyze This takes the cheap comedic route.
Analyze this? Come on, it's a fucking comedy.
The Sopranos succeeds at such a high level despite its premise due to its use of anti-climax, subversion, and commitment to realism. TV shows that were later inspired by The Sopranos, like Breaking Bad, have a formula and structure in place. This formula and structure is in place to build and grow to a grand crescendo. We, as the audience, are conditioned through our years of consuming film and TV to subconsciously identify and recognize the tropes within that formula. Gus Fring is set up as the antagonist in season 2 of Breaking Bad. Our gut reaction is wanting the antagonist to go away because we essentially want the protagonists to win. If that means that Gus Fring has to die or be killed, then so be it. That in many ways is our reaction regardless of whether it is subconscious or not. And ultimately Gus Fring dies in season 4, so our expectations are almost always met when watching Breaking Bad, and it is satisfying nonetheless. The Sopranos in many ways is the antithesis of this logic. There is never really an underlying antagonist on the show, and the show is never really interested in playing one side against another. And The Sopranos isn't really interested in genre tropes either, it is only interested in character behaviour. Tony even has a good relationship with the FBI that are investigating him. These are the literal people who searched his house on multiple occasions, yet he has a good relationship with them. If this were another show, then the FBI would be the clear antagonists of the show for the protagonist to get away from. However, The Sopranos is so mundane that it makes you feel safe even when Tony is talking to the FBI. Now, if this was Breaking Bad and Hank was attempting to go after Walt and Jesse, we would still want Walt to win despite Walt having done bad things. This is because Breaking Bad isn't designed to feel mundane like The Sopranos. We feel uneasy and nervous when Hank is investigating Walter and Jesse despite Hank being right, so we still want Walt to win. We feel uneasy because the show is coming from Walt and Jesse's perspective, not Hank's. However, that being said, Breaking Bad also does toy with the art of subversion very much like The Sopranos does. The death of Mike in particular comes out of nowhere and is done to serve the characters. It is intentionally a very anticlimactic and mundane death. Unlike Gus's death, there's no grand crescendo with Mike's death. It just kind of happens, very much like most of the character deaths in The Sopranos. Now, an actual fair comparison to Breaking Bad would be the episode Fly. It's that one episode of Breaking Bad with a fly. Nothing really happens in this episode and it's really mundane. This specific episode stands out like a sore thumb when compared to the rest of Breaking Bad, but it is still entertaining regardless. It's an incredibly divisive episode and you either loved it or hated it for those reasons. In most part, apart from Mike's death, The Sopranos isn't really like Breaking Bad with the exception of that specific fly episode. Nothing ever really happens in The Sopranos and it's very anticlimactic. It gives you the illusion of realism, and just like real life, we don't always have the answers. The realism in The Sopranos really has to be noted. In season 1, it is suggested that AJ has ADHD, but Tony and Carmela ultimately reject that idea. Did Tony and Carmela make the right decision? Well, that's for you to decide. It's ambiguous, and that's something that the show does really well. The Sopranos is never really interested in giving you the answers, rather it is just interested in exploring threads.
One of the great things about doing the show was doing the therapy scenes, in that you can say something. You know, you write a line of dialogue, or you have an idea that happened 3 episodes ago, and then Melfi will ask him, what do you think that meant? So then you, the writer, are forced to think, what did that mean? Because it was only an idea. So you're actually, in a way, forced to psychoanalyze your own ideas. Mm-hmm. We've decided early on just to trust our subconscious and then try to make sense out of it later, rather than design an architecture of symbols.
Well, it works because it has a freshness. It doesn't seem, Germanic.
The suggestion that AJ has ADHD isn't even brought back up until season 5. That is a whole 4 seasons and 5 years without trying to resolve a clear problem. And you know what? That question isn't even answered then either. If this had been another show, this probably would have been a major storyline, but in The Sopranos, it is only 2 or 3 episodes. It is only ever implied throughout the rest of the series rather than being explicitly stated that AJ has ADHD. This storyline in particular, and The Sopranos in general, are very anticlimactic by normal TV conventions. However, it is that ultimately makes the characters in The Sopranos more interesting, and the sense of ambiguity gives them more depth. Hell, after 8 years, Melfi admits that giving Tony therapy was just a massive waste of time. It is anticlimactic and subversive, but it ultimately makes the characters more interesting because questions are left unanswered. Even every major death in the show never feels satisfying. Tony kills Ralphie only after Ralphie becomes a redeemable character. Had Tony killed Ralphie after Ralphie killed his pregnant girlfriend, then that would have been totally satisfying for the viewer. But David Chase deliberately waited to make Ralphie a sympathetic character to then only kill him over nothing. Tony would kill Ralphie over a dead horse, but he wouldn't kill Ralphie after he beat his girlfriend to death. It's subversive and anticlimactic, but again, it works in the aim of realism. The subversive nature also makes most of the character deaths feel a bit more dark, empty, and meaningless. The ending of The Sopranos is also great because it lets you use your own imagination. If we would have seen Tony end with a happy life, or we would have seen him being gunned down, then it would have been disappointing to many. There was no one way to end the show and have it be satisfying, and it also would have veered away from the tone of the rest of the show. Essentially, cutting to black allows the audience to make up their own mind. The finale of The Sopranos allows the audience to ponder and think about the possibilities and what might have happened, ultimately allowing the audience to make up their own mind. And this is true of most other plot lines in the show, like AJ's potential ADHD. AJ shows extreme rejection sensitivity to the point where he tries to commit suicide, and he also has depression and anxiety, which are all signs of ADHD. So, did AJ have ADHD? Probably. The signs are all there throughout the show, but the show is never interested in giving you the answer. The Sopranos is anticlimactic, pseudo-realistic, subversive, and mundane. So why is The Sopranos one of the most important TV shows ever made? Well,
the fact of the matter was I didn't want to be working in television ever. I wanted your job.
Direct to feature.
Directing features, but it never, for whatever reason, it never happened. And early on, I started making money in television, and so I went for it. And then I was always singing the blues. How am I going to get out of this? I want to make a feature, and so I would use these development deals to write screenplays. None of which got produced. So the Brillstein Gray thing was another one of those deals. And a guy who was working there at that time, Lloyd Braun, gave me this very inspirational speech, and at that time in my life it was pretty hard to inspire me about television because I didn't like it. And he said that he had me over there because they felt that I had a great series inside me. This is exactly what he said, and I thought, and he meant it. And he said, we don't want to get in your way. All we want to do is help you get it out. And he said, for example, would you like to do a series about The Godfather? This is in the lobby at Brillstein Gray. I said, no, I don't want to do a series about The Godfather, but I do love gangsters. So driving home, I remembered this had been a movie idea. The Sopranos had been a motion picture idea.
That you'd had.
That I'd had, which my agents had said, don't bother developing that because it won't sell. And so I'd listened to that. And so I had this idea in the back of my head, and I thought, I wonder if I could make that into a TV series. And so that's what happened.